back up.
Yeah, I gotta help. I thought I could trust them, but they tried to kill me.
Slow down.
Who's trying to kill you?
Choctaw.
Sure wasn't just some fair-skinned niggers. Ain't no Injuns around here for miles.
They took my wife. Oh, God. I'm a coward, ain't I? Hey, I got gold. Them dirty Injuns meant to rob me. They ain't get all of it. Y'all can have it. Don't let them hurt me no more.
Bert?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Histories Collective. We are back. My name is LaChris Robinson Jordan. I am a historian and a genealogist, and I am super excited to be presenting this particular presentation to you guys today. I started it off with a clip from Sinners. As you guys know, Sinners is rocking it out in terms of movies, winning. I won't say, I might as well just say winning, but actually being nominated for 16 Academy Awards, which is a record in the history of the Oscar nominations. But in any case, I played that clip because I wanted to make a reference to it and to make a point about the Mississippi Choctaws, specifically as it relates to Senator Hiram Revels. But before we get into that, I just wanted to say I hope you guys are doing well. I know 2026 is going by really, really quickly already. January is almost over. And you guys know that if it takes me a while to create another video, it's because I have something really awesome in the can for you. And this is it. The title of this one is More Indian Than African, a genealogical case study of Senator Hiram R. Revels. And I wanted to talk about this one in particular because, as you guys know, we often will hear the first African American doctor, the first African American politician, the first African American nurse, like it goes on, right? And in this particular case, Senator Hiram R. Revels is considered to be the first African American senator. But I want to talk about that for a minute and talk about how this misidentification happens to us. But in any case, let's move forward. And I want you guys to also look at this video when you have a chance. It's called You Were Never Black. This was one I had done some time ago to really outline how we actually ended up being labeled Black and how a lot of that was based in the education system that we came through. So when you have time, please reference that. I'll also provide a link to that video in the description. So let's dive into it. Let's see here. We have a few things to talk about here in this presentation, and we'll start off with the historical timeline of the Civil War and Reconstruction. We'll move into the Indigenous surnames in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We'll talk about a brief history and the genealogy of Senator Hiram Revels. We'll talk about the legal fight, Revels' path to becoming the first quote-unquote Black U.S. senator. And we'll also then turn to primary and secondary sources, particularly newspaper reports of Revels' Indian ancestry, as well as the Dawes Rolls. And we will talk about the significance of oral history as that is presented. So let's dive in, you guys. And the reason why I want to talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction a bit is because when you talk about the senators, a lot of the senators of color, if you will, there was a history that led to this dynamic. And yes, Senator Hiram Revels was the first free person of color to become senator. And I wanted to kind of outline what that included and how we got there. So when we talk about the Civil War in particular, I want to go through the timeline so that we're reminded as to how we got there. As you guys know, Lincoln was elected president in 1860. And then a few months later, in April 1861, the war between the states begins. And as you know, the firing on Fort Sumter was the beginning of the conflict. And then in 1863, Lincoln declares freedom for enslaved people by creating and writing the Emancipation Proclamation. Then in 1863, he also gives another infamous speech called the Gettysburg Address. And then in November 1864, he wins re-election. So that is critical and important to knowing this when we talk about the Civil War. Now, what happens is that in 1865, literally 4 years later, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders, officially ending the major fighting in the Civil War. And so a few days after that, Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth and dies the following day. What happens, of course, is the Vice President Andrew Johnson becomes president. So there's a lot happening, as you can see, in a very short amount of time in relation to the Civil War. And you can only imagine the time, everything that happened during that time. So now, one of the things I want to say, kind of back up a little bit, in March of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau is established to aid the formerly enslaved. And this was a really important dynamic for many people who had been enslaved because many people were displaced. They didn't have assistance, they didn't know where to go, and they had no foundation, supposedly. So, in December of 1865, a few months later, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. This is the formal abolishment of slavery. And I want to say this about the amendments in general, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, is of course, these were all created during Reconstruction, or I should say, ratified and became solid with relation to the Constitution during that time. So in 1866, the Congress overrides President Johnson's vetoes to pass the Civil Rights Act and extend the Freedmen's Bureau's life. So as you can see, President Johnson wasn't very much for supporting, if you will, the freedmen and the Civil Rights Act. And that's a whole nother topic there. He's like another documentary in itself. And then we'll move forward in 1867, the Congressional Reconstruction begins. This is where you can formally say that a lot of the Reconstruction movements and systems begin to be put in place. And in 1868, the 14th Amendment is ratified, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law. And, I'm not here to bring up birthright citizenship, although I've probably made about 3 or 4 videos about it. But I want to stress to people, without bringing up the topic per se, that the birthright citizenship was, again, specifically for the descendants of slaves and current slave or former slaves, so that they could indeed receive citizenship and equal protection, whereas they didn't have it before. So if there's any confusion about that, yes, the 14th Amendment was a Reconstruction amendment. And then we move further into the timeline here. And one of the things you find is that the southern states, including Mississippi, which is where Hiram Revels became senator, they had to rewrite their constitution to regain representation in Congress. So, in order to become part of the United States again and truly remove themselves as the Confederate States of America, they had to rewrite everything, including their constitution. And so on February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment is ratified. And that basically prohibits voter discrimination based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So literally by 1870, we have amended and ratified the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments. So in January 1870, the Mississippi legislature elected Revels to the U.S. Senate. Now, I wanted to mention that Revels was chosen to fill the short term left vacant. It had been left vacant since 1861, which was, I think it was, yeah, it was Jefferson Davis's seat. So basically, he was elected to the legislature, but it was only a short term. So, and to be exact, February 25th was the formal date of his senatorial career. And I put in this that he becomes the first Negro, which is basically how he was described during that time. Everyone calls him African American now because, as you know, our status keeps changing from color to black to Negro to African American. So that is, I'm just using the term from the times. And he held that seat until 1871. So this is a picture of him or a sketch of him being sworn in. And basically, Mississippi was trying to do their best to commit to the Reconstruction systems and things that they had to do, but they also wanted to avoid committing to a long-term appointment amid instability. So, they went ahead and gave him a seat that was available and actually helped them politically. So, one of the things to note is that the state legislature was Republican controlled. And so during Reconstruction, a lot of the Republicans included formerly enslaved men, free people of color, Northern Republicans, and Southern white Republicans. So a lot of the people and the politicians that were representing various aspects of our government were actually formerly enslaved men and free people of color, which is a whole nother documentary in itself. So before I get into Hiram Revels' ancestry, I want to do a kind of like a general overview as to the indigenous surnames that we see in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is where he was born. And he was born in 1827. So during that time, he was born to parents who were free people of color, as was described in the census records. So that meant that his ancestors had been free since before the American Revolution. Just wanted to make that quick note. So I wanted to also show you the surnames that we see in early Fayetteville, North Carolina, and some of these surnames were very were indigenous, I guess you could say, or were related to indigenous families. And here we see the Bynum, Fields, George Gibson, many names, including the Revels name. And the reason why I show you guys this is because I know many of you are doing a great deal of genealogy and you're noticing patterns yourself. You're seeing certain names and you're seeing clusters of names that are suggesting that many of the people that are in the census are actually indigenous families. And why this is so important is because when we are doing genealogy, it's all about patterns very often. And the Revel surname is especially important because it appears across North Carolina, Virginia, and Mississippian communities, which were later tied to indigenous displacement and reclassification. Now I have a whole lot of Revels in my family tree, and this in particular is very much of interest to me because I want to know more as much as I can about my family. Now, the Revels that are in my tree right now are actually Revels by marriage, but I definitely wanted to do some study and deep dive on who they were. And as many of you know, when you see certain surnames, you say, oh, I know that this is an indigenous name based on the region. Now, one of the things I did was when I was doing genealogy on Hiram Revels, um, father, grandfather, great greats, and all of that, I found that the Revel name actually originated in Yorkshire, England. But here's the thing that I want to remind everybody is that even though some of these names, many of these names come from Europe, we have to also remember that some of these men who came here had no wives. They came here unattached, they didn't have families. And so when they came here, many of them ended up marrying into indigenous families or marrying women that were already here or it was arranged for them to be here. And there's a really fascinating book called Tobacco Wives, which tells you a lot about that. But in particular, these men were marrying, yes, into indigenous families. So yes, we were quote unquote adopting the European names, but in essence, they were actually, the European was in the minority, if you will, because there were so many indigenous people that were here and the European had to figure out a way to adjust, especially if he was coming without a family. Yeah. So the other proof of surnames, and I always say this as a genealogist, that you have to have paperwork to show the history, to show the patterns, to show all the dynamics. And many of these surnames will show up in militia rolls, they'll show up in land grants, church records, and definitely early census clusters where you see people labeled as mulatto or free, as many of you are probably already finding out when you do your own genealogy. So, why Fayetteville matters in particular? Well, Fayetteville sits at the intersection of the Tuscarora migration routes and Cape Fear trade networks, post removal of indigenous settlements, and the free people of color communities. And when you think about North Carolina in general, you're thinking about Virginia, which is really not just West Virginia, but the entire Virginia territory, South Carolina, Tennessee, all these areas are where many indigenous peoples resided and lived for centuries. And but particularly after the Tuscarora War, there were many removals. And but having said that, many of the families stayed behind and they just blended into the church and town life, and they were reclassified racially by the state. And they avoided reservations. Now, when I speak of reservations, as you know, many of the reservations really did not become really formalized until after about 1820 to 1830 when Andrew Jackson was pushing all of the, I guess you could say, one of the last pushes of the indigenous peoples off the land from Georgia, Alabama, and those areas and pushing them west towards Oklahoma. So but we were still avoiding those areas because quite frankly we had created our own systems, our own towns, and weren't necessarily reliant on the reservation system, which it's a whole video in itself, and I will do a video on how the quote unquote reservations came to be and how we coexisted with that system, but also knowing that that wasn't necessarily an option for us because many of the indigenous peoples that were on the reservations did not want us there. So there's that part too. So there are other indigenous associated surnames I wanted to share with you guys too, because I think it's important for those of you who are watching, particularly if you're watching for the first time, that you know that genealogy is my passion at the heart of things. And I want to share with you what I've learned too. So when you talk about specifically Fayetteville / Cumberland County / Cape Fear region, these surnames repeatedly appear among the Tuscarora descended families, the Lumbee adjacent communities, and the indigenous families that were reclassified as mulatto or free colored after removal. So, in addition to the earlier names, here are additional names that you may come across as well, like Bell, Brayboy, Brooks, Brown, Carter, and others. Also, Dial, Goins, Graham, Hunt, Lowry, of course, Locklear, and then Maynor and Mitchell, Oxidine. I have Oxidines in my family as well. Oxidine's married into the Fultons in my family tree. And so I have Oxidine cousins. So, yes, and again, I want to make this note, and I know that some people may say that, well, a surname alone does not prove indigenous ancestry. And you're absolutely correct. It's not enough just to say, oh, my last name is such and such. What does matter, legally speaking, is the appearance of the term free colored or mulatto categories in the U.S. Census, land ownership before 1830, tax status, church membership, and consistent intermarriage within the same surname clusters. I think it's very, very important that we have documentation that supports many of our family's oral history, as well as the other evidence that we have gained and garnered from our genealogy. So these are specific pieces of documentation that is essential to proving your indigenous ancestry. So now that we've done that, let's talk about the genealogy of Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels, which is very, very important here. Now, when I did the genealogy on him, and remember, I didn't do a deep dive. I this was just, I would say, probably about a week of looking at documents and looking at the tree. But looking at his ancestry, I looked at areas where they resided, and there's North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, in addition to Mississippi. But these were the kind of the clusters of where the Revels, in terms of Hiram Revels relatives, lived. Now, what I found was that Hiram Revels was actually a mix of different indigenous nations. And I found Accomack, Choctaw, and the Cherokee. And of course, he was born in Fayetteville and he died in Aberdeen, Monroe County, Mississippi. And his father was Reverend Elijah or Elias Revels, and he was a full-blooded Choctaw, born in Mississippi. And he died in Cumberland County, North Carolina. And then his grandfather was Stephen Micajah. Forgive me if I'm butchering his name. And he was born in Rocky Mountains, Georgia, and died in Nash County. And his great grandfather, Edmund Revel, or Revels, was born in Nash County and died in Robeson County. And then his second great grandfather, Charles Manokin Revel, Accomack Indian, was born and died in Somerset, Maryland. Yeah, it's deep. So when you look at his paternal line, you realize that it goes back pretty far into the 1600s. And it goes back even further than that. And I just stopped at his second great grandfather, but it goes further back. Now, before the Senate, Senator Hiram Revels, he studied theology and became an ordained African Methodist Episcopal minister, or AME minister. So that was basically his training before he became a senator. And he went all over the country as an itinerant minister, and he served congregations across Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Missouri. And in 1860, he settled in Baltimore. And then he he continued to minister and was a principal of a high school for quote unquote Black and Negro students. And he also got married in Ohio as well. And during the Civil War, he helped recruit and organize the U.S. colored troops. And he served as a Union Army chaplain, ministering to Black soldiers during the war. And I want to also note that his brother, as well, and I'll get to him in a minute, was also a surgeon. And he also served in the Civil War and helped many soldiers, many soldiers as a surgeon. So post-war, he was in various leadership positions in Mississippi, and he relocated to Mississippi during Reconstruction. And he quickly became a respected religious and community leader in Natchez. Now, this is something to be mindful of, is that, remember, Mississippi is where his father was born. So he still had relatives and a base in Mississippi, even though his father had been gone for some time. He left North Carolina, I think right before, not North Carolina, but he left Mississippi right before Hiram Revels was born. Well, after Hiram Revels was born, because his father sent his mother to North Carolina ahead of him. And then Hiram Revels was also president of the Alcorn Agricultural University in Rodney, Mississippi. And he was there for many years, from 1871 to 1883. Now, let's get into the legal fight that the senator had to endure. Now, remember, he hadn't told anyone that he was Indigenous at all. His family knew, and of course, his colleagues knew, and I'll get to that in a minute too. But it wasn't as if he himself was telling the world that he was Indigenous. And I'll tell you why. So, when he got to DC, the Democrats basically challenged his, his senatorial election. And their argument was that he wasn't a U.S. citizen because he was a quote unquote Negro. And they were relying on the 1857 Dred Scott decision that said people of African descent were not and could not be U.S. citizens. And therefore, no quote unquote Negro could have been a citizen before 1868. And so, since the Constitution requires 9 years of prior citizenship to be a U.S. senator, Revels was allegedly ineligible. It was a really weak argument because we're already in 1870. The 14th Amendment has already passed. So they were basically hinging their argument, on the Dred Scott case, which is insane. So the Republicans counter argued that that Hiram Revels was a free person of color before the Dred Scott decision. So Dred Scott didn't even apply to Hiram Revels. And because Revels had been free, he had been educated, he had been legally recognized, and he was voting and serving publicly before the Civil War even. And they additionally said that the Dred Scott decision was an erroneous one because now the 14th Amendment had nullified it. So it was a bit of a battle to get him confirmed because the Democrats were challenging whether he was a citizen or not, which was interesting. And the reason why I find that interesting is because they were basing it on the fact that he was a Negro, right? But they didn't talk about his Indigenous status. Now, and that's the key insight for me here, is that Revels did not assert his Indigenous legal identity because that would have complicated the case. And it's interesting, the Democrats didn't bring it up either, because at that time, American Indians occupied a different legal category and were not automatically U.S. citizens. And so invoking Indigenous identity would have introduced treaty law. But I also think that no one wanted to really bring up the Indigenous identity of Hiram Revels, because that meant that you would have had to question anybody who you called Negro, because how do you know that they're indigenous or Negro, so to speak? This is where it gets really tricky, and we begin to see how identity is, yes, made up, and at the same time no one wanted to challenge the indigenous status of a man who looked like a Negro. Like, we can go back and forth on this all day. It's just fascinating to me. And Hiram Revels was not going to challenge it. He wasn't going to say anything because the goal was to become a senator. And so he wasn't going to argue it because legally the case was winnable. And there was nothing for him to do but just kind of go with the program. And Republicans already had a clean argument for him anyway. I mean, he's already free, and he already had a pre-war civic life, and that meant that he was already a citizen. So there wasn't anything for anyone to say that was going to muddy the waters, i.e., being an indigenous man. And so many American Indians at that time were considered members of sovereign nations, not U.S. citizens. And so citizenship for indigenous people was inconsistent and conditional. So to make it clean and simple, Senator Revels and the Republicans said, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about him being indigenous or a Choctaw or any of those things. Well, here's what's really interesting. So, the question of the day: if legal survival requires silence for a U.S. senator, what did it require of ordinary people? And I pose that question because when we talk about being indigenous today, so many people challenge us. And they challenge us because it's not been in quote unquote popular culture, or it's not been talked about very often. Because how do you talk about something that our ancestors had to be quiet about? Because it was illegal to even talk about your indigenous status, which is a whole nother documentary in itself. But I wanted to put that question out there, that it was survival, particularly, but in the case of Senator Revels, it was legal. He didn't or could not talk about his indigenous status because it just would have opened up a whole can of worms, and he would not have gotten confirmed as a Mississippi senator. So let's move on to the newspaper reports. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because even though he never said anything, people already knew that he was an Indian. Now, I'm just quickly showing you guys the tree. I did a quick snapshot so you could see he had siblings: Reverend Elijah Revels Jr., Eliza, his brother, Absalom. And it's interesting because Absalom, like when you look at one of his documents, he's described as being Asian. They called him Asian in one of his documents, which is so insane. But in any case, this is just a quick snapshot of his family tree. And I just wanted to show you his paternal line again, so that as we get into the newspaper reports, you'll see why his ancestry was not a secret. It just was not, because people knew who he was and where he came from. Now, in the Lancaster Intelligencer, which came via a story in the Nashville Union, right after or right before he was officially confirmed, they were already saying that he was more Indian than African. And in the article, it says, there is very little Negro in him. Quote, his paternal ancestry was Indian of the Choctaw tribe. His father was the Reverend Elijah Revels, who was a mixture of Indian and African, the former preponderating. Now, of course, we don't know he was African. People make that assumption. But if he's full-blooded Choctaw, what does that mean? Is he part African? So it's interesting how they worded things in the newspapers, but it was quite clear that people already knew about his indigenous status and were writing about it. His father was reported as Big Injun in times of Auld Lang Syne from the Mississippi's reservation, and his grandfather, it is claimed, fought with the Patriots at Stony Point with Mad Anthony Wayne. And Anthony Wayne was one of the founding fathers of the United States. He was a well-known figure in American history. But this was in February 16th, 1870. So they were already writing about his status, his identity. And but again, no one challenged it to a great degree because he needed to become senator. He needed to be, right? Because this was during Reconstruction and they wanted to ensure that they were complying with the United States government. So to argue whether he was Negro or Indian would have just muddied up a lot of waters for so many reasons. So we will continue on and talk more about other um, aspects of his ancestry. So let's move to the census for a minute because I do want to show you guys this because this is also very important to showing a person's ancestry. And the census, as you know, is a primary document. So here, the Reverend Elijah Revels, he is listed as a free colored person. And this is in 1820 in Cumberland County, North Carolina. So this is in 1820. Now, when we move forward, we go to 1850, we see that Hiram Revels is in North Carolina. No, he's actually in Wayne, Indiana at this point, and he's probably already preaching for a church, and he's listed as mulatto. And they have his birth date around 1825. But some of these birth years are off a bit. In 1860, we see him again. This time he's in Baltimore, Maryland, and he's 35. Again, he's mulatto. Move forward into 1880. He's now in Mississippi. He's 52 approximately. And as you can see, he's now Black. Yeah. So, and this is something to note for you guys as well. So when you're tracing your family's census reports, and I have a spreadsheet that I keep on my own family, as I do note when their identities begin to change. And you see that happening around, yes, 1880, 1900s, 1910, 1920, but you definitely see people becoming Black and Negro, colored, and all of that around 1930, 1930, 1940 for sure. So he goes from being mulatto to Black. And now in the 1900 census, he's now in Mississippi still, and he's still considered Black. I just wanted to show you guys that and show you how that changes in real time. Now, there were additional papers that talked about his identity after his death. So when he passed away, people were still writing about his status. And this came out of the New York Times. It was special to the New York Times. And he was listed as a quadroon, the son of free colored parents, which, the term quadroon was contradictory because, if you're truly a quadroon, by definition, only one grandparent would be African, so to speak. And so saying he was the son of free colored parents suggests both parents were classified as non-white. So that combination doesn't mathematically align under the racial logic of the period. But in obituaries in particular, they often reflected the public reputation and social classification and not necessarily the family knowledge or documentation. But yes, when he passed away, he was described, at least in this article, as being a quadroon. And then again, in the Baltimore Sun, he's listed as more of an Aborigine. Now, if you notice, this is something that they repeated. They're repeating an article that was written back in 1870. So, but they just switch it up a little bit. Now, see this paragraph. Although Revels passed for a member of the race formerly held in servitude, he was in reality more of an Aborigine than a Negro. They're saying he even passed for a Negro. So yeah, that's a whole different discussion if you're Indian and you're passing. Now it says here in the same article, his paternal ancestry was Indian of the Choctaw tribe. His father, who was a minister of the Baptist Church, having a mixture of Indian and African blood in his veins, with the former predominating. His mother was a Scotch woman, or you can say Scottish in today's terms. So as you can see, they were kind of repeating things that had been said previously, but with a little bit more information. But I just thought it was interesting how they said he passed for a member of the race formerly held in servitude. Now, and then this other article in the News and Observer on January 27th, 1901, he's not a Negro, but a Croatan. Croatan, am I saying that correctly, you guys? So the death of former United States Senator Hiram R. Revels of Mississippi has revived a curious story regarding his ancestry. He was always classed as a Negro, being a tall, well-built man with the chocolate skin and curly hair of an African, and the devout bearing of his profession, the ministerial. And Revels, however, was not a Negro or of mixed blood. He was at least the descendant of two other far higher races. Yeah, this is how they wrote about us. And they talked about, according to Dr. C.A. Peterson of St. Louis, he was undoubtedly a descendant of that mystery shrouded band of settlers that Sir Walter Raleigh planted at Roanoke in 1587, and that disappeared from white knowledge a year or two afterwards. So they're basically saying that he descended from the settlers who had come with Sir Walter Raleigh in Roanoke. And that's a whole interesting chapter in how the settlers were left for no one, they had basically been abandoned, and they were left to fend for themselves because there was no help, there was no one there to assist, and they didn't know how to survive. So they stayed and figured it out like a lot of settlers did, you know. So they're saying that he's descended from those Europeans. So we're getting to the heart of this, you guys, and I know I'm kind of going through this very quickly, but there's so much to unpack here. And I want to say this too, that this is just me, getting to the surface. I didn't even do a deep dive on his genealogy. This is me spending time with him for like a week and a few days. But I found out enough information to say that he's not completely African in terms of the African American. He's more indigenous. So, but in any case, I want to even go deeper because I want to go to more primary sources. We left the secondary sources, which are the newspapers, but the primary sources is Dawes rules. And I want to show you guys the significance of oral history. Now, to give you guys a little bit about the Dawes rules without going into a long explanation about it, but basically, the Dawes rules was it was a way for people to receive land from the government, but it wasn't a census; it was an allotment system, and it basically applied to only the five civilized tribes: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cree, Muscogee, and Seminole. So what it required was that you had to live in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, basically. And families living outside Indian Territory were usually excluded regardless of ancestry. Because remember, many were pushed out of the Southeast and ended up in Oklahoma. So if you weren't in Oklahoma, they automatically excluded you, knowing that many had not left. But in any case, enrollment depended on paperwork, prior rolls, and the examiner approval, not oral history. And what's interesting about that is, of course, many people didn't have paperwork because most things were destroyed after removal. Like people didn't have their papers; they didn't have anything to prove and say that they were actually indigenous. But to exacerbate it, applicants who didn't speak the language or live in tribal communities were often rejected, and that still happens to this day. Surprise, surprise. So, but in any case, this is what's interesting. Now, Hiram Revels' daughter, Dora R. Leonard, she submitted an application on December 10th, 1901, in Carthage, Mississippi, on behalf of herself and her three minor children, seeking identification as Mississippi Choctaws. Now, in her testimony, where she testified under oath, she said that she claimed 1/4 of Choctaw blood. Now, this is the other thing about the Dawes Commission and the Dawes rules was that it was this thing called blood quantum, which was, which was quite unfair because how could you really prove that you were 1/4, 1/2, or full? But many people knew that they were, and they said what they knew. But in any case, she stated that her father, Hiram Revels, was 1/2 Choctaw, and that his father was a full blood Choctaw Indian. And Revels' father was from Mississippi. He sent his mother north before his birth and later returned south. And the family was raised in the north for a time and were never enslaved. And what she meant by north, she meant North Carolina. So keeping in mind is that this oral history, again, is incredible because his daughter knew who her father was. Her father made sure that she knew. And based on all of that oral history, she went to then apply for a land allotment and to be recognized as a Choctaw Indian. Okay. Now, during her testimony, which is you see here in the application, and some of these applications, most of them are very lengthy. They asked you tons of questions, and sometimes it was a variation of other questions. But those interviews were usually five to 6 pages typed out. So she testified that both of her parents were deceased, and that she knew of no living individuals who personally knew her grandfather. Which is interesting because that is what often caused you to be rejected for, I mean, there were many reasons, but if no one could corroborate your story, it was just you saying it. But she also testified that her father spoke or understood the Choctaw language, occasionally using it at home. Wow. So she also acknowledged uncertainty about whether the language spoken was definitely Choctaw, because again, there was no one to corroborate that. But here's the thing, he knew the Choctaw language and used it at home. So not only did he know the oral history of his own family, he knew the language. He was Choctaw. And she knew it too because she had heard it in the home. Now, her other sister, Ida Redmond, also applied for status through the Dawes. She was also rejected, as you can see. So both sisters, both of them, who at this time were already married, had applied. And you can see here on the application that she states her father was Hiram R. Revels. So the family knew who they were. They knew who they were. Now, the key takeaway from this is the testimony of the Revels daughters consistently showed family knowledge of indigenous ancestry, but there is no documentary, treaty-based, or jurisdictional proof that they had. This, which was required by the Dawes Commission, they didn't have that. They didn't have that information. But despite that, they still knew who they were. They knew they were Mississippi Choctaws. I'm sure they had heard many stories of their father, grandfather, his father, and his father, and on and on. So that is the story of Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels and his family, who have been misidentified in history as African American. So please share this video far and wide and show people, because here it is. It's documented, it's proven, it's real. And as always, we appreciate your support. We appreciate all the comments. And I cannot wait to hear the comments on this video. I cannot wait to hear your comments. And as always, we really just appreciate the energy and the erudition that we see. And I do try as much as I can to comment and to acknowledge everyone's comments. And as always, please follow us and subscribe to our newsletter. We'll be talking to you guys real soon about so much more. This is going to be a very, very interesting and heady year for us. Have an amazing, amazing day, evening, wherever you're from. Thank you so much for joining us at the Hidden Histories Collectives. I'm LaChris Robinson Jordan.